That was a very loud grunt as I sat down there. I just noticed.
Right?
I'm getting to be that age. Welcome, everybody. We are back. Sermon deep dive. This one is a fun one because we get to go over one of Noah's sermons, not one of my sermons.
Oh, no.
So, for those of you that got a chance to tune in to our Sunday service this Sunday, you got to hear Noah's sermon. If you did not get a chance to hear it, it will be getting uploaded tomorrow to our YouTube channel, so you can go check there if you want to rewatch the sermon, get a little bit of context of what we're talking about. But we've been using this time at the very beginning to give you all a chance to get to know us a little bit better, asking some funny questions, some kind of get to know you questions. So I'm just going to kick it off for us today. I have a this one's not as funny. It's just a serious question. I want to get to know you a little bit more.
I've got a funny one, so that
perfect. We just kind of switched roles. So, what is something that you find embarrassing?
Ooh, oh shoot. A lot, actually. I would probably say that the most embarrassing thing is if I notice that any type of thing in my clothing is not the way I intended it to pan out, you know? And I notice, like, after the fact, it's like one of the most, like, embarrassing things ever. I really care about clothing.
Like what? Like, what's an example?
Like, I mean, well, like a zipper down is like the first one that pops into my head, obviously, but anything like this is going to be a little TMI, but like sweat stains are a big thing. Like anything like that, like I'm just like instantly super embarrassed. So yeah, no, definitely that would be the
wardrobe malfunctions.
Wardrobe malfunctions are they're the worst. So yeah, I would say that.
Okay.
All right. Here's a more silly one.
Okay.
In the most theologically rich and dense way that you can explain this, why do we park on a driveway and why do we drive on a parkway?
As the psalmist would say in Psalm 131.
Oh, no.
I do not concern myself with things too wonderful for me. There are certain things that we are just never going to know. And I do not know why that is the thing that, why those are flipped the way that they are. It's a mystery. It's a mystery.
Oh, tune in next week for the part 2 of this where we talk about what's not a driveway, bridges and roads. And
yeah, just city planning with Noah. That's what we're doing right now.
So there you have it. Nick doesn't know an answer to a question. You heard it live here on Wayfarers.
And that's okay. The psalmist said so himself. That's okay.
Right.
All right. So, before we get into it, I want to try to summarize your main point from the sermon on Sunday, and you tell me if I was paying attention, if I got it right, or if you're like, no, that's not at all what I said. I don't know where you got this from. So grade me on my comprehension here.
Okay.
My understanding of your point with the sermon was that you read from 2 Peter. I'll read the passage here in a second.
But
1 Peter, chapter 2.
Yes,
there
Peter.
You go.
That's
where I got the 2 from.
F so far on the test.
Not a good start. 1 Peter. And you really focused on the phrase that we were supposed to be a holy priesthood, that we're supposed to be priests.
Right.
So you gave us a little bit of history of what the people of Israel were supposed to play that role as priests, and that we are functioning in that role as priests as well. Mm-hmm. And you said there's kind of two things that make a priest a priest. One is like their holiness and their set apartness in that sense, and then the other is their vocation, of being that bridge to God. And you felt like we as Christians have focused too much. We recognize that we're priests, maybe. Most of us might not say it in those terms, but we focus too much on the holiness part. We focus on being separate from everybody.
Right.
We don't focus on being a bridge. And I remember before the sermon, I don't remember if you mentioned it in the sermon, but the whole series we've been doing has been on what the real good news is, what's the actual gospel, the real good news. And your point you said to me was that part of being a royal priesthood, part of the good news of that is that it means that the gospel is good news for the non-Christian.
Yeah.
For the person who is not a part of that priesthood necessarily.
Right.
They still get to reap the benefits of that bridge role that we play of connecting to God. And if we focus too much on our holiness, we will miss that vocation of being that bridge.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. You got it. Yeah. A+. Wow.
All right. I was actually listening. I got to pay attention. It was great. I got to like sit on my couch and watch the live stream. It was a whole different experience.
I wish I could do that. Man, I haven't done that yet.
Yeah, you haven't had a chance to do that yet. We'll see. You may not get a chance.
I know, right?
Speaking of which, I did say in the stream that the reason I was staying home was because I had had a possible coronavirus exposure. So good news, if I didn't update all of y'all, my friend who I had the exposure to got tested. Their test came back negative. So
Yay.
We are all in the clear. That's why I'm here.
Right. I was about to say, I don't think you'd be here if it had been a negative.
Yeah.
I mean, a positive.
Thank you to any of those of you that prayed for us. The tests came back great, and we can join the real world again.
Woo.
So, all right. So I got that right. You feel like I explained that correctly? I guess.
Yeah.
Let me just reread that passage.
Okay.
And I'm just gonna. I have a few more questions for you that I wanted you to help kind of clarify for us a little bit. So it was 1 Peter 2.
1. Chapter 2. Yeah.
Chapter 2.
Yeah.
1 Peter chapter 2.
Yeah.
Starting in verse 1. So, therefore, rid yourselves of all malice and all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander of every kind. Like newborn babies, crave pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow up in your salvation, now that you have tasted that the Lord is good. As you come to him, the living stone rejected by humans, but chosen by God and precious to him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. So, you have talked a little bit about the role that, you talked in your sermon a little bit about the role that we all play as that holy priesthood.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems to me that part of what Peter is saying here is that there was a decisive role that Jesus had to play,
right,
to really make that all a reality.
Exactly.
And how do you begin to build that argument? Why do you think Peter is saying that? Why was it important that Jesus play the role he did to be able to really inaugurate that holy priesthood?
Yeah, so I think I may have mentioned this a little bit in the sermon, but one of the main things is this kind of concept of humanity being unable to fill this role as a priesthood, right? And we're unable to because we've been tainted by sin, essentially. And so, it's this idea of a mirror. Way back in the beginning, God intended for us to be this priesthood, to be this shining light of who he is to the rest of the world. And because we're marred by sin, we're not able to do that anymore. And so the hope is that one day humanity will be able to get to that point, to be able to be this bridge, to be this holy priesthood to everyone. And so you're exchanging who God is with every other human that's on this earth. And since humanity can't do it, what God has to do is actually step down into humanity and do it himself, essentially, in the form of a human. And so that's really where Christ comes into the picture as this rescuer from humanity's plight. And so that's what Peter is looking at, is he's looking at the fact that humans were broken, mirror-wise. They couldn't reflect God's image anymore. And now Christ comes on to the scene as this perfect human that can actually live out that vocation. And so what the early Christians looked at and what they saw was that, hey, some human actually was able to live out what everybody had hoped we could live out. For the entire Old Testament onward, Jesus was able to do everything. And so now rather than trying to do it ourselves and sort of like making up a new way to try and get there. We can actually follow in Jesus's example and be able to accomplish that. So that's why like it kind of shows how he's this cornerstone, like this stone that's the original stone. That's the original. Is basically a cornerstone in the First Temple kind of period in this New Testament period. Was the idea of every stone that follows is essentially built on top of that stone, and is that stone is like the pinnacle. If you pulled it out, the whole thing would crumble.
Right. And if I remember correctly, that's how they would build buildings. Is the cornerstone would be like the first stone that they would lay, because it like is the square. It's the one that needs to be like perfectly square, perfectly level, because all the other bricks, all the other stones get built off of that cornerstone.
Exactly.
So if the cornerstone is a little crooked, if the cornerstone is not level, if the cornerstone isn't perfect, then the whole building gets all off kilter when it gets built from there. So Jesus being the cornerstone for this holy priesthood, he's the one that gets us on the right track from the beginning.
Right, exactly. And so it's that it's basically Peter looking at the life of Christ and how he reflected God, and how he lived a perfect life, and through his life he accomplished the redemption of humanity. And we then take that same life, that purpose to try and redeem things around us, and we live that out. And so we, in a lot of ways, are basically living the same type of life that Christ did. And that's why Paul uses a lot of the same language of like buried in baptism, risen in new life. Is a lot of these phrases of the life of Christ and how Christ lived, we also live in our lives as well. Even Christ will say, take up your cross and follow me. Like there's a lot of examples in which the life of Christ is lived out as human, like we live out the life of Christ.
Yeah.
And so there is that really
humans and God, or the world and God,
mm-hmm.
was the purpose all along from the very beginning. That's the role that humans were supposed to play, and humans have failed at it because of sin.
Right.
We're just bad at being a holy priesthood.
Mm-hmm.
And what we see in Jesus is that he is the successful human, the one who does that priesthood job the way it was supposed to be done.
Right.
And so if we are going to be following him, doing what he is doing, then he makes it possible for us to also be successful at our job, and to like participate together with him in that.
Yeah.
Role.
Hebrews 2 actually has a very particular word. I can't remember it in the Greek, but you can basically translate it as trailblazer.
Oh, yeah.
It's
Hebrews 2, you said?
Yes, it's Hebrews 2. It's at the very end here. I can pull that up.
Okay.
Yeah, you got it.
No, I don't have it yet. I don't see it.
1 second. I think it's at the end here.
And so it's a particular Greek word that means like trailblazer.
The
one that like sets the path that we.
Yeah, essentially it says like he undergoes this life of pain and suffering for us, and that he trailblazes a way for us to follow in after him. And so it's in this way that we're able to really engage with the gospel, and not just I believe that Christ died on the cross for my sins and that's the end of the story. It's that no, you actually live that death on the cross in your own life, and you actually live that mediary position in your own life as that bridge between humanity and God. So yeah.
So I found it in Hebrews 6.
Oh, is it in 6? Okay.
Where he does say, we have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure, It enters the inner sanctuary behind the curtain, where our forerunner,
There it is.
trailblazer,
Yeah.
Jesus, has entered on our behalf. He has become a high priest.
Right.
And he
Yep, that's
talks
it.
about- And so, again, it's just connecting that whole idea. Jesus is that priest who goes before us first and blazes a trail, but the idea is that it's a trail that we then follow in his footsteps.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, you've been really helping me understand that lately. We've had a lot of conversations where you've talked about that the gospel message is not necessarily just this like one-time event that happened in the past, but it is a path that has been set before us. And so Paul uses all this language of like participating in Christ and
Right.
being united with Christ. And so it's this whole idea that like we're being called to continue in the work that he started and is currently doing.
Exactly. Yeah, a lot of Paul actually starts to make sense when you think of the Christian life as attempting to live the very same life that Christ lived. And so you see Christ get baptized, right? So we get baptized. You see Christ start the Lord's Supper. We also do the Lord's Supper. You see Christ take up his cross. We also take up our cross. You see Christ is resurrected, and you talked about how resurrection is the ultimate goal that we all hope for. And so the story of Christ is really the story of humanity in narrow focus, essentially. You get to see the entire story of humanity and the ultimate goal of that in the story of Christ. And that's our main hope, is that we will be resurrected one day.
So Jesus is particularly fulfilling, because we always think of Jesus in his like how he is God and all the divinity stuff that he does, but it sounds like what you're focusing on is the fact that Jesus was the like true human being who truly did human things the way.
It's actually interesting that Jesus refers to himself mostly as the Son of Man, and there are several passages actually where when the disciples call him the Son of God, he shushes them and says, "Hey, don't actually like say
because there were like
aloud."
all kinds of titles people used to talk to Jesus. They talked about like Son of David, which had like messianic stuff, Son of God, Son of you know. But the one he uses the most to talk about himself is Son of Man, specifically. And he focuses on that human thing.
Exactly, and Son of Man literally just means human. Adam is referred to as the son of man at one point, I think, and it's that idea of you're human in the most fullest human sense possible. So it's I think it kind of decries like that Gnostic view that we've talked about in previous weeks, where they said that
he just looked like a human. He wasn't really a human.
Right, exactly. No, Son of Man literally means this guy is human.
He's the most human that's ever been.
Yes,
human.
yes.
Like he is the truest version of a human.
Yes.
That's why I've always thought it was really cool when Jesus is being put on trial and Pilate goes to present him to the crowd. He has this like famous saying he says, where he says, "Behold the man." And Pilate didn't even realize it, but he was kind of being prophetic in that moment, because it's interesting to me that he doesn't just, he pushes Jesus out there. He tells the crowd, "Behold the man." And he's kind of being prophetic. Yes, this is the man, the true human, the human above all humans. And who knows what Pilate thought he was saying, but there's obviously something very prophetic that he was saying in that moment when that's how he presents Jesus. He presents Jesus as the man. But you pointed out that Jesus uses the term Son of Man to refer to himself the most. But that's not original to Jesus. That comes from somewhere, right? Where's that reference?
Right. So the main reference you'll find is actually in Daniel chapter 7.
Okay.
Daniel, actually it's a pretty long passage. Do you want to read it, or do you want me to just summarize it?
No, I'll go ahead and read it, because I've got it right here. Daniel chapter 7. You want me to read the whole passage?
You can skip the beasts coming out of the water part, and if you just want to focus on the bit where the books are opened and like you see the like high council and everything like that. You should. There's just
I got it here.
Yeah.
So, So just to summarize, this is the prophet Daniel
Mm-hmm.
in the Old Testament, in the book of Daniel. He has this vision, and like you mentioned, there's this crazy part where he sees all these beasts, these crazy-looking animals.
Something out of like Godzilla or something like
that. Yeah, just these crazy huge beasts. But then after that, it says here, it's Daniel chapter 7, starting in verse 9. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. Ancient of Days is a term for God, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So God takes his seat. His clothing was white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. So he sees all these heavenly throne room of God, and God is sitting there, and there's all of these spiritual attendants that are attending to him. Thousands and thousands. Lots of fire. It's real metal. It's super epic.
Right.
And then I'm going to skip ahead here a little bit, but then he says, In my vision, at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed.
Yeah, that's sort of the theme that's being displayed there, is that a human rises on a cloud and is given this reign as a king over all the world, right? And that's the prophet promise in Daniel, right? And remember what I said in the sermon was that you had a lot of prophets that came on the scene late in Israel's life that was saying that, hey, we know that humanity and their image nature, like their ability to show who God really is, has been tainted, it's been destroyed. But one day we're promising that a human will come and redeem all that, and will be able to ascend to the point of ruling again. And maybe one thing that I didn't bring out as much in the beginning is it's not just that humans are meant to shine God and show who God is, but it's also their intent to rule. Like they're told in the Genesis narrative, multiply and rule over all the earth. And so it's not just that they're meant to show the rest of the world who God is. They're also meant to be the kings of this world. They're meant to be the lords of it. The only thing that is higher than them in terms of like ruling is God.
So there's like this two-part to what the humans are supposed to do.
Right,
One
right.
is kind of be that mirror that reflects the glory of God back to the world. But secondly, it's to kind of like be, if God's the king, then humans rule on his behalf. They are the ambassadors on God's behalf that are like out there representing God and ruling over the world as well. And so in this vision, Daniel sees God in that throne room and the light and the glory and all of that kind of stuff. And the fire. But then he sees this, what he says, one like a son of man, like
ascending.
Ascending. It's like a man who's coming from the earth and he's going up into this heavenly throne room, kind of being like caught up in the clouds and sent up to the throne room. And this son of man is given that authority to rule and be the one that is, in charge, fulfilling that job that humans were supposed to do. From
Right. And the reason that it opens with the four beasts is the beasts are actually meant to represent human kingdoms and rulers of these kingdoms. And so what's Daniel saying here in this chapter is that, hey, I know that like the Romans and the Greeks are going to rule over all the earth and they're going to cause a lot of mayhem, and it's going to look like
they're the ones
they're the ones in charge. Yeah, it's going to look like these humans that just have awful morals and kill people for no good reason, and it's going to look like they're in control of the world and the world is falling apart because they're in control. And the promise is that no, there will be a man, a human being, that will restore his position as ruler over all the earth. And he will be this, really, what Paul says later on is a second Adam, a second ruler that represents all of humanity. And he will restore that initial ruling that happened with Adam and Eve.
So he becomes the true human that we humans were supposed to be.
Exactly.
And so you said that this when the ancient people of Israel were reading these passages, they recognized, they're like, man, I can't wait till that day when that Son of Man guy comes, because everything's going to be put back to right, and it's all going to be the way it's supposed to be. And then it's not just Daniel; all the other prophets keep referencing this.
Exactly.
This king that's going to come, who's going to make the world right, this human being who's going to come and fix things to how they're supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think lots of times we forget that the early Jews of Jesus' day, of that first century, what they were raised on was these Bible passages. That's what they read every day, every week, and on Sabbath. All their Shabbat readings was like this stuff out of the Bible. And these were the stories they were taught as kids. This is what they grew up on. So they knew they memorized a lot of these verses. They knew a lot of these stories. And so when Jesus comes on the scene and he calls himself
the Son of Man,
they would have immediately been like, that's from Daniel, isn't it? I remember that. That Son of Man? That's the guy? The guy that we've all been waiting for? The guy that's going to come and rule?
And it's funny, too, because the disciples thought that he was literally going to crush Rome, which would have been one of the beasts, and he was going to do it in a military way.
Right.
And
so he's gonna destroy these evil empires.
Exactly. Yeah, he's going to just
beasts.
like come in and just level everybody. And the turning point in the story is when Jesus says, I'm going to be lifted up on a cross, not as the like ruling of everything.
Not as this like triumphant conqueror.
Right.
But the way that I will be lifted up, to that kingship is
through
cross.
suffering. Yeah. And through humiliation. And so that's actually, I think, the moment that the Pharisees actually get really mad at Jesus is they're in the high council room. They ask him, "Are you the Son of God?" And he responds to them not by answering their question, but by saying that you will see the Son of Man lifted up today and enthroned. And in that moment, they all like up in their tables, because what he's claiming in that moment is that he's going to become king over the known world.
Yeah.
And so they, crucify him. Yeah. And so that's why that statement in your Bibles, and I think it's in every gospel that's recorded, where Jesus says, "You will see the Son of Man lifted up," is so hurtful to the Pharisees, because they don't want a king. They don't want that, and so they
and they don't want him to be that king.
No, they don't want him to be that. No.
So it's like really controversial, and that's why I had never. Became really important to me to really realize how. That's why it's so important that. That's why they like put the robe, like that purple robe they put on Jesus in the middle of the crucifixion. That's why they put a crown on his head.
Right.
That's why they write a sign that says
Jesus, King of the Jews. Yep.
That they particularly put, because they knew what he was claiming. He was claiming to be king, and they're like, "Oh, haha, yeah,
we'll mock you
for claiming to be king." But in that really unexpected way, Jesus is saying, this is my enthronement. I am becoming king through this way that you did not expect me.
And so to pull it all the way back to 1 Peter, that's what we're in for. Like that's what our lives is going to look like, is in being raised up. We're going to be raised up on crosses, not on pedestals,
Yeah.
And that's why Peter makes a huge point to say the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, is to say like this unexpected, this very important thing to all of us is a thing that's held in complete disregard by the rest of the world. And that's what these people are going through right now, is they're going through suffering and they're going through persecution. And so Peter is reminding them that the life that Jesus led is not a great life. Like, it ends very, the ending and resurrection's great, but the climax of the story is ultimately super painful and miserable.
Yeah.
So
if he set the example for us, if he's the trailblazer, if he's the forerunner, and the way he did that was by suffering,
right,
then we are being called to that same sort of life. And that's what Peter's reminding them of. He's saying, remember, we were supposed to be priests. We're supposed to be this bridge. Look at how our example priest, our high priest Jesus, had to do his job. And so if we are doing our job, it's going to be the same. We're going to be out there having to suffer for the cause of Christ, but it is a part of what it means to participate in the way of Jesus. If you're
right,
you can't do the way of Jesus without doing it the way he did, which involved suffering and pain and crucifixion.
Yeah,
which doesn't sound like good news.
No. But the ending of the verse is really actually heartening, because he says, taking all that in mind, you offer spiritual sacrifices, right? And what kind of sacrifices are in the Old Testament is a way to appease sin, to remove sin, to offer a blood sacrifice to purify people. And so all of this imagery of what sacrifices do in the Old Testament is being displayed here. And what Peter is saying is that through all this suffering, through all of this misery, what you are going to do is you are going to begin to purify. You're going to begin to take away the sins of those around you. I think I said this in the sermon, but I think one of the worst things that Christians have done is to stop praying for the sins to be forgiven of the lost. It's something I do regularly, is to pray for lost people's sins and to ask for those to be atoned for. I believe that Jesus will forgive them. That might be a little controversial, but it's just me personally. I believe that you can see that.
You want to have that faith that Jesus is going to hear your prayers and you functioning in that role.
Yeah.
And so the problem, to go back to your sermon, the problem is that we have focused only on being holy and not on that intercession bridge role that we were supposed to have as priests. And the problem is when we do that, when we focus on, like, I got to get my life right, I got to not have sins, I got to not be tainted in any way, because I got to be holy. When we focus on that, we miss out on the priesthood part of our vocation, the connecting God to the world, lost world, especially, that we can do. We focus too much on one half and miss out on the other. And so because of that, like you said, you had that conversation with the friend of yours that just said that why do Christians just focus on all these rules that don't have to do with anything? And I think that's the problem, is that when we do that, when we only focus on being holy and not on being priests, the good news of the gospel doesn't seem like good news.
No.
It just seems like God's a killjoy and he wants us to not have fun. And so it doesn't seem like good news.
Right.
But the example we see from the early church was that they understood that. Again, Peter's reminding them. He's like, don't forget, this is part of your job. And as they got out there and fulfilled their job, it didn't matter what people thought about them. They were still able to see that this is good news for people. The example I've always given. I mentioned it in my sermon a couple weeks ago about there's a really cool book I like called Destroyer of the Gods that focuses on those first Christians, those early Christians. And the author in it, he gives this really great example about how in ancient Rome and ancient Greece, they had this this practice where if you, because they didn't have contraceptives, they didn't have, so they would often get pregnant and have kids that they didn't want. And it was totally acceptable in that day and age. What you would do is you would take that baby and just leave them outside to die. And it was considered morally fine. There was no issue with that. There was no issue with just getting rid of the baby that you didn't want. They even had a term for it. They called it exposure. They called it exposing a kid. They didn't even call it murder. They called it just exposing. They had this like euphemism term that they used. And it was like totally fine, and everybody did it. So if they just happened to have sex, get pregnant, not want the kid, as soon as the kid was born, you would just set the baby outside your door and let them starve to death, basically. And the Christians were so appalled by that in the early church that what they started doing is every night, whenever it came exposure time and people would be setting their babies out, the Christians started going around at night and scooping up all of the babies that were being left out. And that's the very first time you started to see some orphanages pop up. They started to have these orphanages where they would care for all these babies.
Yeah.
And it became such a big deal in certain cities that the Romans and the Greeks just figured, well, we'll just save them a step. We'll just take the baby straight to the Christians because we know the Christians are going to come anyways. So let's just take them straight to the. And so as the Christians would build these orphanages, the pagans would come and they would just leave their babies on the doorsteps of the orphanages directly because they knew the Christians were going to come get the babies anyways. And that's where you kind of can in movies, you always see in movies where like an orphan will be left on a doorstep of an orphanage, like in a little basket on a doorstep. That's where that comes from. It comes from, it just became so common for the Christians to care for those babies that they, everybody was like, yeah, just go leave them on the doorstep of that house over there. The Christians, for whatever reason, they just take care of all these babies. So if you have a baby you don't want, take them to the Christians and they'll take care of it. And that's the sort of thing that just becomes good news regardless of how you feel, because that regardless of the fact that these people felt like they didn't want these kids anymore, they were like, well, at least I know I can take them to this orphanage. I know I can take them to these Christians. They'll take care of them. And so regardless of what you thought about the Christians, regardless if you thought they were weird, I think you pointed out on Sunday that they thought they were cannibals sometimes.
They did think they were cannibals.
Because the Christians talked about eating Jesus' flesh and drinking his blood. And so they were like, man, those Christians, those weird like cannibal Christians, they're super weird. I don't understand what that's about. But they care for the orphans. They care for the widows. They care for the poor. That's the point I was making. They always make it a point to help the poor. And so regardless of what you thought, they were doing their job, and it looked like good news to the rest of the world. It seemed like something that they were excited about.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely a dual sort of feeling in the Roman camp where like they would do things that helped babies like that, but at the same time they also looked down on them for completely destroying like oligarchy and systems and things like that.
It was a very love-hate relationship.
Yeah. It was definitely
they loved what the Christians were doing, but they had some issues with certain things that they were doing.
Very much like today, honestly, is that there are some things that I think we do as Christians that non-Christians love. And then there are some things we do that they don't understand at all.
And it's interesting to me that the ones who had the most issue with the Christians were the ones in power, not the weak and the oppressed. So it was the soldiers and the rich and the aristocrats and the one percenters of their day were the ones that really had the biggest issue with the Christians because they were mixing things up. In that Destroyer of the Gods, there's a letter that is shared, and it's an early letter, one of the first letters from a.
Is this Pliny?
It might be, but it's written from a Roman aristocrat who is making fun of the Christians, you know, and he's kind of trying to dismiss them and trying to say, you know, nobody should be. He's trying to discredit the Christians.
Yeah.
And the big phrase, his culmination of his argument is he says, everyone knows that Christianity is a religion just for women and for slaves. And it's this very disparaging, derogatory, you can just hear the like smugness in his voice.
Yeah.
Where he's just like, Christianity is just cool if you're a woman or if you're a slave. Any self-respecting man would never be caught dead as a Christian. That's kind of the tone that you get from his letter, which of course isn't true. We see from the New Testament that there were rich people that were a part of the church. There were landowners that were part of the church. There were men. There were women. But again, the oppressed, the people who were the lesser ones in that society, the women, the slaves, the children, the ones who just were like nobody cared about them, they found community and belonging in the church that they did not find otherwise. And so when this like Roman aristocrat is trying to discredit Christianity, he just leans into his like privilege in a way and just tries to say, well, you know, it's fine for those lesser people, but you know, no self-respecting person would be found as a Christian. And so those are the people who ended up having the most issue with Christians were the elite. The elite. Yeah, that's the word. And so I think you see that lots of times. I think that is a component that you see when Christians are truly being Christians, is that the people who have power, the people who are in charge, don't like it very much. They tend to have issues with that, because they did with Jesus. That was the whole thing. You pointed out that the Pharisees and the Sadducees and these Jewish leaders, they did not like Jesus, and they get up in arms whenever Jesus finally says, "You're going to see the Son of Man lifted up." They can't stand it, and you know, part of it is because they were in power. They were the ones that had the power at that moment in time. Yeah, and so they were afraid of losing that power, losing that influence.
Part of one of the things I learned recently is that the people that Jesus ministered to were primarily people in Galilee, in the poor regions of Galilee, and
not in the capital
city of Jerusalem. And so I was always taught as like a Sunday school that the people that loved Jesus the next week would turn around and authorize his execution, you know, and that it was the same people who loved him one week and then they're just silly Jews. They just flip flop. They flip flop, and then whatever the leaders say, they're going to go with. And it's not accurate at all. Actually, the people that were shouting Hosanna as Jesus was coming into Jerusalem, the verse is very specific. It's all the people that were a part of his group that were coming and shouting that. Like the disciples are the one that's instigating this, and it's not the same people that shout Hosanna as the people that authorize his execution, because the people in Jerusalem are the elite. Like they're the ones that like are very like enshrined in these systems of political power, and they're not the ones that have known Jesus up until this point. It's the people from Galilee that are shouting Hosanna and calling him king. So
that's really cool, because the very first sermon I preached in this whole series was one where Jesus specifically says the good news. You know, he's announcing the good news. Yeah. And he says it's for the poor, it's for the prisoners, it's for the blind, it's for the not powerful people. That's who he like is laser focused on as who this is going to be good news for. This is going to be good news for the least of these, the people that are not the ones in power. And so,
well, and that's kind of the scandal of it, is that, like, I mean, to go back to the Son of Man idea, is humans now in our time find ways to get power through their own means, and they don't find ways of getting back to the image of God way, because that way is through suffering. It's through the cross. It's through putting yourself lower than your neighbor. And so a lot of the rich have a harder time, like the more elites, they have a harder time giving up that rule that they've already earned through their own way.
Right.
They've already earned it through either birth or financial success or what have
Right.
you, and to sacrifice all that and to go a different way, which is a way of always putting yourself least in the
Right.
kingdom of God, is very difficult for any human really to do.
Right.
And it was easier for the poor because
What do they got to lose?
what do they have to lose?
Yeah.
Yeah. What, like they and that's why Jesus says, like, it's easier for a camel to be thread through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. It's
Right.
I don't think he's messing around when he says that.
He's not saying it's impossible.
No, he's not
but
saying it's impossible.
It's hard.
But he's saying it's hard. And so it's that getting back to what God originally intended for us to do was to rule, yes, but rule under his terms, not on our own terms.
Right. And so the problem is that the way the world likes to rule is through like power and like power plays and like subduing people and conquering people and so we even talked about this earlier. There's a scene where the disciples are asking Jesus who's going to get to sit at his left and right hand,
Yeah.
And so they're like, Jesus, tell us. We've been arguing, but just go ahead and tell us. When you enter your kingdom, when you become king, when you're finally enthroned, who gets to sit at your left and who gets to sit at your right? Because, when the king's thrown, the most important seats are the seats to his left and to his right. Those are the most important people. And Jesus kind of turns around and you can just kind of see, he's like, you don't know what you're asking. And those of us who know the whole story, we kind of have this like flash forward moment in that moment, and you just see the cross. You see the moment where Jesus is enthroned, and on his left and on his right
Are
two thieves that are also being crucified.
Right.
And so when these disciples are like, Jesus, which of us gets to sit on your left and your right when you become king? He's just kind of like, you don't know what that means. The way you become king in the kingdom of God, the type of king Jesus is not the king who goes in and conquers. He doesn't send in the tanks.
Right.
He sends in the people with crosses on their backs. I've mentioned that before. That's a line from a theologian we both really like, Nate Mentee Wright. He says that all the time. He says when the kingdom of God arrives, God does not send in the tanks. He sends in people with crosses on their backs. And I think that is an essential part of what it means to be the kind of royal priesthood that we are supposed to be as Christians. We are supposed to be those people who sacrifice for others, who suffer for others if need be, and take up that cross in the same way that Jesus did.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not easy, No, we're not saying it is. I don't think even Jesus says it's easy.
Right.
But
it's easy for us to talk about because we like to talk about the idea of it, the theology of it. We're idea guys.
Living it out. Yeah. I mean, you and I, even in our personal lives, have struggled with that.
Right.
So,
right. I had a personal experience once that really this hit home for me was with one of those, short-term mission trips that a lot of Christians will take where they go overseas somewhere and help. Yeah. And I got to go to the country of Haiti right after that big earthquake that they had a few years ago and help out in an orphanage. And I have this memory of that moment where it really came to terms with, for me, that the people in the churches that I was at, because I would visit all these churches, and I would just see people like sing and worship God, and it was just like with all their heart, and they were just super into it, and I realized that some of these people, they were so poor, they had nothing, literally nothing. Like they had like a shirt and some shorts and some sandals. That's like all that they owned. They didn't know where their next meal was going to come from. They didn't, they had nothing. So literally they had nothing but Jesus. Like Jesus was the only thing they had. Wow. Like if you had to just like, what is your one possession? It is like, I have this relationship with the God of the universe. That's like my one thing. And I realized that their relationship with God was like so authentic in a way that mine had never been, because I had a lot of other things that I did that, I had multiple possessions. I did not just have Jesus like they did. And so I think that's been the hardest lesson I've had to learn, because it's really easy for me to think of the rich as like other people,
Right,
you know,
right.
like the 1% in the U.S., the Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos, and the politicians. They're the ones,
Right.
But I've really had to come to terms with the facts lots of times that I am the rich. I'm the one who's never had to wonder where my next meal is going to come from. Obviously,
Right.
I'm not the one that's ever had to. So I recognize that sometimes it's easy for me to talk about that role of suffering. I'm like, yeah, that's what we need to do as Christians. We need to suffer, because I've never really had to suffer.
Yeah.
And so I recognize that it may be not as impactful coming from me.
Yeah, I felt this a lot similar to you when I started running Avenue Coffee, because the finances weren't great there, and I spent the whole year worried for my job, for my livelihood, for just so many different things. Worried that I'd disappoint pretty much every staff member there that I was over, and just felt like a failure a lot of the time I ran that. And one of the things that I realized was that mentally I would go in these spirals in which I would play out like every foreseeable option of how this was going to end and how everybody was going to hate me at the end of this because I had run this thing into the ground, and just like end up in a very dark place because of it. And what I ended up having to do one night, I remember it distinctly. I drove home after a really bad night, and I got home and I just like sat on the couch, and I kind of had to say, what in my life is my own? Like what in my life can I not lose? Because right now it feels like everything in my life
is about to.
I can lose.
You could lose any minute now.
Every day I was like, if money didn't come in, it was like I could lose literally my income. Like I just, and if I lost my income, then I wouldn't be able to pay for school for the next semester. I wouldn't get my degree, and then I'd lose all my friends because, it all goes under. And
so you're like, what's the one
what is
thing
like,
I can't lose?
What is the constant in my life that like I won't lose? And it just came back to me that the only thing that I had was Jesus. And there was a lot of comfort in feeling that, even if I end up a homeless man on the streets, even if my worst fears are made realized and I have to figure out how to live without income, I won't ever lose Jesus. And that was like a moment that was the moment I started praying really consistently, is just knowing that nothing in my life that I have is guaranteed, and the only thing that's guaranteed in my life is Jesus. So, yeah.
Yeah. And that's, I think in some ways, to bring it all the way back around to the original First Peter passage that we started with, I think that's what Peter's trying to remind them of. He's trying to tell these Christians who've had to go through a really hard time. He's trying to tell them, remember your vocation, remember your job, remember what you're supposed to be doing. This is a part of what we're supposed to be doing. If we're following Jesus, we're going to be suffering. That's part of what we're supposed to be doing. But don't lose hope. Don't let it become hopeless. Don't become super depressed about it.
Right.
Because you know that you have this surefire thing, which is the relationship that you have with the God who created everything and who is the one that is in charge. That's the one thing you can bank on. You can, no one's going to be able to take that from you.
No.
They can take your life. They can take your possessions. They can take your happiness, but they cannot take the sureness of the relationship that you have with God away from you. And for both me and you, that has been something that's been helped us go through the difficult times that we've had to go through, is that that is one thing we can bank on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you feel the same way, but for me, I've always loved to rule from my own power.
Right.
I've always wanted to.
We want to conquer the world on our own terms.
Yeah, exactly. But every sermon I preach is really a sermon against myself, and it's. Yeah, I have this tendency to always want to have everything figured out. I never have to. In my ideal world, I'd never have to pray to God for anything because I'd have already fixed every.
You would have the power, and you would know exactly what you need to do to
exactly,
fix the
problem. Exactly. In my ideal world, everything would be set and sure, and you never have to worry about a single thing in your life because everything was certain to work. And I've just had to learn that God doesn't want that life for me. He wants a life in which I'm constantly praying to him, and I'm constantly saying, not my will, but your will be done. And that learning is shifting from this position where you think you can rule on your own terms and shifting to a perspective in which God is the ruler and you have to rely on him for daily bread. You rely on him for this amount to come in every day for you to keep on going. And I think that's what I really wanted to get across in this sermon was that what you see is humans having to become priests where they're relying totally on God and they're teaching humans how to
do that
on God. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And they're teaching that the way to success is not the way that everybody else lives their life, not this vain pursuit for financial.
It's not about the hustle.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's not about the, get up there and hustle and work harder than everybody else.
Yeah, the achievements and everything. It's about laying down that control and looking to God. And I think that's the role that Christians can play in non-Christians' lives. And I think you get to see two different types of rulers in that sense. You get to see a ruler with a crown of thorns, and you get to see a ruler with a golden crown. And you get to make your choice. And that's really what every Christian should walk around with, a crown of thorns. Mm-hmm. It's that idea of we are submitting our control to God, and that sometimes means misery. So,
yeah. So, it's a concept that both of us have had several conversations about, and we're hoping to unpack more and more as we go along with the sermons and with the deep dives that we're going to be doing here at Wayfarers. I do think it's something that I don't remember growing up hearing much. Was that part of what it means to be united to Christ and participate with him is to participate in his sufferings as well. But there is this really crazy, cool theology when you follow that thread all the way through the Bible, and you realize exactly what that means, what that could mean for the world if you had an entire priesthood of people who were ruling in that way instead of conquering. So, you have anything else, or are you feeling...
I think, if I said any more, I think it would just be like overstating the case. So
we've made the point. Like I said, tune in if you want to watch Noah's sermon. I encourage you to do that. It's going to be up on our YouTube channel tomorrow. You can just go on YouTube and look for Wayfarers Christian Church. You'll be able to see Noah's sermon from Sunday, where he explains a little bit more about that idea, why the gospel is good news for those that aren't Christians. And I would encourage you to tune in this Sunday. This is kind of the end of the series. I'm ending the series this Sunday with what is the good news actually, and what's kind of the culmination of the good news. And I'm not gonna I won't spoil it. You got to tune in to see
Oh,
exactly what the
really? No
culmination is
teaser
here.
today.
No.
What?
But I'm just going to end it with how the gospel was kind of the first glimpse I got personally of the gospel being good news for me in a way that was actually exciting and not just
What you had heard all the time in church.
what I had heard in
and
church.
hadn't
Absolutely.
really ever hit.
Right. Absolutely. So
I'm excited
like
for
you
that.
said, it's going to be, we both often just preach about things that are important to us.
Yeah.
And so you'll get to hear a little bit of our heart through that. And we hope you recognize that as we go along. But yeah, tune in this Sunday and you'll get to hear a little bit more about what was one of the big shifts for me in learning about the good news. So hope to see you all then.
Thanks, guys.